It's really been a blessing for our community to host Dr. Udel over this past Shabbat, over the weekend, and we're very grateful to the University Center for Jewish Studies for coordinating and organizing and partnering to bring in Dr. Udel and Dr. Newton, and particularly like to thank Professor Morris for her efforts, going back really, I think, a year plus. It's already a year and some months that the coordinating and some of the details began to coalesce. So without further ado, thank you for being here. Hope you feel right at home, and thank you, Professor Morris.
Well, thank you also to Rabbi Davis. It's really wonderful for us to be able to host this tonight. Many years ago, some of you might remember that we hosted Larry Schiffman. He had been our speaker, and then we partnered with Darchei Noam. But this is the first time that the Center for Jewish Studies has hosted one of our community lecture series here at Darchei Noam, and I look forward to many more events like this taking place. So it's really a great pleasure and an honor to welcome Miriam Udel and also Adam Newton, who isn't physically here tonight with us. And I think that tonight's talk will be the culmination of what I have heard was a wonderful weekend of learning with Miriam throughout Shabbat. Again, thanks to Rabbi Davis for all of your energetic work. And yes, I don't even want to think about how many emails there have been in organizing this. I also want to thank Debbie Kuznets for all of her help. And as always, we are very grateful to Mariel Coulter, our assistant in the Center for Jewish Studies, for making everything run smoothly. Tonight's talk is also co-sponsored by the Department of German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch, and the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Minnesota. As many of you probably know, the Center for Jewish Studies Community Lecture Series is a partnership between the university and the community. For this reason, we are especially grateful for the generous gift we have received in memory of Julia Kay and Harold Segal that has enabled us to continue to bring cutting-edge speakers in Jewish studies to the community. If you'd like to find out how you can help ensure the growth of the Center for Jewish Studies, you can visit our website. You can speak with me afterwards at the reception or with Natan Paradise, our associate director of the center. It really makes a difference, and we thank you for your support. So now it's really a delight, and again, I want to say a pleasure and a privilege to be able to introduce Miriam Udel, who I really have wanted to bring to the Twin Cities for a number of years. So I'm so glad it has finally happened. A noted scholar of Yiddish language, literature, and culture, Miriam Udel is Associate Professor of German Studies and Jewish Studies at Emory University. She has been a Star Fellow in Judaic Studies at Harvard's Center for Jewish Studies, as well as a Fellow of the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture. Her interests include Yiddish modernism and anti-modernism, the rise of the Yiddish novel, the relation between modern and classical Jewish literature, and American Jewish literature. I also want to mention that Miriam's Yiddish language students founded a Kleine Welt, the world's only all-Yiddish college a cappella group, which I would love to hear more about. And I don't know if it's still going, but I did find that very enticing tidbit on the web. She is the author of Never Better, the Modern Jewish Picaresque, that appeared with University of Michigan Press in 2016, and which won a National Jewish Book Award in the category of Modern Jewish Thought and Experience. Her annotated, translated anthology of Yiddish children's literature, Honey on the Page, is slated to appear with New York University Press in the fall of this year. Her talk tonight is entitled A Sabbath for Socialists, Yiddish Children's Literature Between Sacred and Secular. Please join me in welcoming Miriam Udel.
So really heartfelt thanks to Professor Morris, to Natan Paradise, to Rabbi Davis and the community here at Darchei Noam that has made me feel, me and my family, has made us feel so welcomed here over the entire weekend. I always like to make the work of care visible, so I thank my husband, Adam Zachary Newton, in absentia, because he is back with the little one who has hopefully gone to bed a while ago, because we tired him out at the zoo today. So it is really a pleasure to be with you and to talk about a kind of story that the existence of which at all is surprising. And you'll see why quickly when I describe it. So this is a mini genre. It's a subgenre, but it's really just a mini genre. We have a few stories that I think form a kind of distinct identity, wherein the protagonist is traveling somewhere for some reason on Friday. People know where this is going. And the Sabbath arrives, and it's always a he so far, I haven't found a single one with a female protagonist yet, he has to make the decision, what am I going to do about Shabbos? Am I going to claim pikuach nefesh, the exemption for privileging the saving of a life over all other considerations, or am I going to stop and observe the Sabbath? And the decision that he makes in these stories is to stop and try to keep the Sabbath as best he can, and then supernatural things occur to help him, and all goes well. He survives the experience, and he goes on his way after the Sabbath with some kind of change. It might be a subtle internal change, it might be something that is externally recognizable, but he goes on his way altered by the experience. Now, nothing about that is surprising yet. Why shouldn't there be such stories for Jewish children? Sabbath is a really important value in the Jewish religion. Keeping it requires a lot of intentionality and planning. Exposing children to the idea of that from a young age is a good idea. But here's the part that's surprising. The writers of these Sabbath tales, as I call them, were all somewhere on the leftist political spectrum. Socialists, Bundists, labor Zionists, all different varieties of leftists. And they were all part of a secularizing movement. Now I say secularizing rather than secular because the binary between secular and religious really begins to break down when we subject it to any kind of pressure or scrutiny. But they were going in a certain direction. They were trying to push the Jewish people in a certain direction, and that was toward a greater embrace of the secular world and the values that that world held to be central. So these were leftists, and they were writing these stories, and I want to talk about a couple of them, one at much greater length. The other one I'll just dispense with briefly because I think that it's probably a more familiar story to some of you because it's actually been reworked as a children's tale several times and published in English a few times and even circulated by the PJ Library, which some of you might have access to. So that's the story of the magic lion, or the der wunderlicher Leib, the wonder lion, or the magic lion. And that's the story of a rabbi. This iteration that I'm going to tell you about now was authored by Yankov Pat, who ran the Bundist school system in Warsaw before coming to New York and doing work on behalf of the socialist schools in New York. He ran the Bundist school system, and he wrote this story in which a rabbi has to go on an important mission to save a life. Mission unspecified. But we know that he's going to save a life, and so whatever he's doing would be important enough to defer the observance of Shabbat. And he has to go through, and then the story is set in the Holy Land, and he's departing from the city of Hebron, and he has to go south through the desert to do this important mission. We have a subsequent version of the story that says that he was going to collect charitable contributions for the yeshivot, for the higher academies of Jewish learning in Jerusalem. So he needs to travel through the desert, and he makes an arrangement with a caravan that is armed, that has camels, that has water. That's the safe and proper way to go through the desert. So he arranges with them that he's going to travel with them, and when they keep going on Friday night and Saturday, there is an older man who's part of the caravan who's going to stay and wait with him, and then they're going to proceed together to catch up. Well, they didn't bring enough water, and 4 days into the caravan, they were out of water, they were running out of provisions, the people were unhappy, the animals were unhappy, and they decided nobody could stop. And the old man decided, you know what, if I stop with you, I'm going to die, I'm going to keep going. So the rabbi, of course, faces the decision as the sun is setting on Friday, do I stop or do I go? And he decides to stop, and he puts down his pack. And that's one of the features of this mini genre, the putting down of the pack, because that's the moment when you've really made your decision, right? So he puts down his pack and he begins to pray the afternoon service for Friday and to wait for the sun to set and begin his Friday night prayers. And he has a little bit with him. He doesn't have wine with him, but he has some bread that he can use as challah. And so the story fills in the detail that he can not only make the blessing over the challah, the hamotzi, with that bread, but he can even say the Kiddush blessing that we normally would recite over wine. He can make that blessing also. So he can fully sanctify the Sabbath. He does so. He begins his humble repast, and then right before him, leaping into his visual frame, is a lion. And he realizes, this is probably my time to die. And when it's your time to die, it's your time to die. That's what it says in this children's book. Welcome to Yiddish children's literature. So when it's your time, it's your time. It's probably my time. But, you know, the lion comes, and the lion does not immediately eat him. So he does the right and proper and decent thing. He breaks off a little piece of bread, and he proffers it to the lion. Would you like some of this bread? The lion accepts it. And, okay, so then it's time to sing some of the traditional table songs, the Zmiris, for Friday night. So he starts to sing the Zmiris, and the lion likes that. And the lion begins to kind of rumble along with him. And he understands, okay, that's the lion's way of singing. And he goes to bed. He says Shema with extra care that night because he realizes that he's probably not going to ever wake up, right? And lo and behold, he does wake up, and it's Saturday morning, it's Shabbos morning. What is he going to do? Say his prayers, say his regularly scheduled Sabbath prayers. So he does, and there's the lion, and the lion roars, and he understands that that's the lion's way of praying. And then it's time for lunch. So he gets out the other roll that he has, or probably 2 rolls that he has still in his pack, and he also makes the Kiddush blessing and the Hamotzi blessing, and he gives the lion some of the lunch. And then he reviews some Torah that he knows by heart. He goes over the weekly Torah portion, and he lies down, and the lion goes away. And he thinks, okay, well, that was kind of nice, and it's over, and that was special. I'll remember this always. So he takes a nap, and the lion comes back, and it turns out that the lion was having a Shabbos spatzir, a Shabbos walk around the premises, right? So even a lion likes a Shabbos spatzir. And so now the Sabbath is winding down, the sun is setting. He says the afternoon service. He waits until he sees 3 stars in the sky. He says the evening service. And then the lion does something very peculiar. The lion lies down on the ground with his 4 paws lower than his hind paws. He has his little lion rump up in the air, as if he were a dog. And he seems to be gesturing to the rabbi that the rabbi should mount him. So the rabbi does, and the lion takes off, thundering through the desert, going faster and faster with the rabbi holding on to his mane, until finally they catch up with the caravan, and everybody is shocked. They faint, and when they recover the power of speech, they say, you really are the Lion of God. They bow down before him and they say, you, Rabbi, we shouldn't have left you behind. You're a holy man. You're the Lion of God. And in case you're wondering, that's how the Arieli family of Hebron got its name. Ariel means Lion of God. It's also my sister's name, sitting in the front row. So I'm looking at her with that significant look. It says that's how the Ariel or Arieli family of Hebron got its name. And so this whole thing has been framed as an explanatory tale about this famous family that actually I've never heard of. And I tried to find it and search for it, and I didn't find anything. But that's the way that Yankov Pat wrote the story in 1919. And as I said, there have been many versions. So as you hear that story, I want to give you some insight into the story grammar, into understanding the genre. So we don't actually have a specifically Jewish story grammar, but the Russian theorist Vladimir Prop has done some wonderful work in anatomizing the fairy tale. And I think we can take some of what he wrote and adapt it to the Sabbath tale. So a wonder tale begins in a situation of stability, calm, right? And then there's a conflict. You need a conflict or you don't have a plot. That's elementary storytelling, narrative theory, right? And then there's a rule violation. Now, in the case of the Sabbath tale, instead of a rule violation, we have a rule dilemma and then the observance or the upholding of a rule, the rule of keeping the Sabbath. And then we have special helpers who come into play, who are that often involve enchanted objects or supernatural animals with supernatural abilities and capacities. And then with the help of these special helpers, the situation finally returns to a kind of homeostasis. So that sounds pretty much like the Magic Lion. There's another Sabbath tale that I want to put before you, and this one is written by you have it here. This one is written by Yankov Fichman, so it's sort of a tale of two Yankovs tonight. We had Yankov Pat, and now we move on to Yankov Fichman. And I'll just tell you a little bit about him, so that you appreciate who you're encountering. So his dates were 1881 to 1958. He's chiefly remembered as a cultural Zionist. He was born and educated in Bessarabia. Now, what's so significant about the Bessarabia Yidden was that, as a rule, if one can generalize, there was little urban development throughout the region. Jews were living in shtetl, in small market towns, or in hamlets or other small, more rural environments. And Jews had a fairly wide range of occupations in Bessarabia, including horsemanship, a lot of horsemanship even among Jews, which was not the case in other parts of the Pale of Settlement and Europe. And perhaps as a result of that, this is somewhat speculative, nobody's written the dissertation yet, but perhaps as a result of that, we see a lot of lyricism in writing about the natural world among Bessarabian-born Yiddish authors. So as Fichman grew up, he spent time in Odessa, which was the cultural hotspot place to be. There was a circle around the Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik. There was also a circle around Mendel Moiches Farim a little bit earlier, but he was in Bialik's circle. And then he also spent time in Warsaw as a young man before emigrating to Palestine in 1912. He got stranded back in Europe during the Great War, during World War I, and so he was kind of betwixt and between Hebrew and Yiddish. He was writing in Hebrew, but then he ended up back in Europe and wrote some more in Yiddish. And so he wrote a lot for children, he wrote a lot of lyric poetry for adults, and he's chiefly remembered as the father of the Hebrew lullaby. He wrote a lot of Hebrew lullabies that became canonical in a very young state that was very heavily invested in creating a literary canon for children. So now that you have the quick 411 on Yankiv Fichman, I want you to encounter this particular story, A Sabbath in the Forest, in as unmediated a form as possible. So the most unmediated way to do that would be if we all took out the Yiddish and read it. That is not so realistic now. So I've translated it into English, but I still want you to encounter it. And I want you to encounter it in the most traditional way possible, which is as a story read aloud. So if you would turn to the person next to you and form a partnership of two, or at maximum a group of three, and read this story out loud. It should take about 10 minutes. And as you read, there are some questions to think about. The main character is Lippe. I want you to think about how you would describe Lippe's Jewishness. What does he know about? What does he care about? What motivates him? How much of his psychology can you tap into? I want you to think about the description of time and space in the story, how time is marked, how space is demarcated. Think about the presentation of non-Jews in the story and the relationship between Lippe and the non-Jews among whom he works and spends time. What kind of language is used in relation to Shabbos, the Sabbath, its rituals, its prohibitions? And then the really big question is, why would a Bundist be writing a story like a Bundist or a cultural Zionist? Why would he be writing a story like this? Which elements of the story were going to be relevant to the children in a Yiddish secular school system? So about 10 minutes, more or less. Ready, set, go. Okay. We're back. All right. Just so you have a sense of what the original looked like. So, as you read A Shabbos involved, A Sabbath in the Forest, and you attended to these questions, what did you notice about Lippe's Jewishness and the way that Fichman is portraying it? How would you characterize his... Traditional. Traditional in what sense?
That Jewish life is really important to him.
Okay, so it has central importance to his identity. Good. What else can we say? That he's devout. Okay? Let me go back over this first paragraph. I always just like to give at least a little tam, a little flavor of the Yiddish. Amol is gewein a Yid in a Kleinstädtel, a Yid a Schneider, hat geheißen Lippe. Lippe der Schneider. Is der Dosiker Lippe gewein a Posheter Yid, kaum davenen gekannt, und a größer Orman, nicht für keinem gedacht, nur das Ormstückel Bräut für sich und sein Weib Nechame mit de Kinderlach hat verdient. Zu leiden Chalile nicht angekommen. So, you have the translation. He was a simple Jew who could barely daven. He could barely recite the words of the prayers, and he was also very poor. But what does he have? So he's not well educated. He's not a member of the religious or economic elite in any sense. He's a posheter Yid, a posheter mensch, a simple Jew, a simple person. What does he have going on for him?
A lot of Jews pick out one thing to concentrate on. For him, it was Shabbos.
For him, it was Shabbos. And he had a very specific rationale for why he focused on Sabbath observance. What was his sort of intuition about it?
Survival.
How so? What was the deal?
Provided for its movement, it really works.
That in the merit of taking this day of rest and keeping it holy every week, that God would provide his family's bread for the rest of the week. So it's a little bit transactional, right? It's a little bit of a let's make a deal. But that was the way he understood his end of the deal and what it meant to uphold it. So he knows and cares about Shabbos. What about time and space? What do you notice about the portrayal of time and space in this story?
Very flexible.
You say it's flexible. I could say the opposite. What do you mean it's flexible?
Well, the whole castle appears, and then it's not there, so it's a huge castle, but it doesn't exist. So
But then it doesn't exist, right?
there's
So,
space, but there's no
okay.
space, so that's flexible.
So that seems flexible. That seems kind of, fuzzy.
Most of the story takes place in the transition zones.
Ah, beautiful. This is a story that establishes a lot of binaries, a lot of things that are absolutely this or absolutely that. Let's talk about that with respect to space. What are the binary zones? And then we'll talk about the in-between. So what are the zones?
Tag by Tag, Woche by Woche.
Okay, so day by day, week by week. So that's time.
And always the same structure, the sameness.
Okay, so this sameness, uniformity of ritual. Okay, good. But for a second, I want to talk about space. What are the spatial zones in the story? Okay, so there's the shtetl, which is home, it's shul, it's everything familiar and safe. And then there are the villages, which are where he works, and they're populated by non-Jews, right? And they are foreign, they're not dangerous, but they are to some degree alien for Lippe. And so every week he traverses from one to the other, and there is a place in between the two, and that is the forest. Now, in Yiddish literature, so on Shabbos I said that one of the major motifs of Yiddish literature is the train, once it exists. Another really critical motif in the Yiddish literary thought world is the forest. The forest is the quintessential site of liminality, meaning of in-betweenness, of uncertainty, where certitudes start to wobble. So this key moment in the Tevye stories, the most emotionally fraught, at least the most emotionally fraught of the stories that ended up as part of Fiddler on the Roof, is when Tevye's third daughter, Chava, marries the Gentile scribe in their village, and her father breaks with her entirely. And she wants to repair the relationship. And she runs after him in the forest. And she tries to stop him. And there's this sort of burlesque of the biblical story of Bilam, where Bilam's donkey can see the fiery sword of the angel of death, and Bilam can't. And the horse, or the donkey, is trying to avoid this confrontation, and Bilam has no idea what's going on. So too, there's a burlesque where Tevye's horse is seeing Chava and trying to not run her over, and Tevye is whipping the horse and saying, "We have to keep moving, we're not stopping, I have no daughter," So then, what you don't see in the movie, and what you don't see in the musical, is that Tevye in the book has this extraordinary moment of reckoning. It's his only moment of really clearly expressed internalized self-doubt in all of the Tevye stories. And he says, God, I wish I were a more learned Jew, because if I were, surely I could find it somewhere in the holy books where it would explain why, if you made Jew and Gentile, there has to be a separation between us. Why do we have to live this way? I don't understand it, but it's your world and you made it, right? So it's the emotional climax of the whole thing, and it could only take place in the forest. The forest is that quintessential site of liminal experience, of going between, of being uncertain. And so Lipa moves every week, usually in a kind of utilitarian autopilot way, between shtetl, home, and village, workaday, parnose, meaning the livelihood that he makes as a patcher. Now, he's not doing any kind of exalted fancy tailoring, right? He's turning over coats, right, in order to extend their years of wear a little bit longer. So it's very humble tailoring work that he's doing, and he just goes back and forth, and his whole world is really structured around the certitudes of these binaries in space and binaries in time. It's either Shabbos, home, the time is overlaid on the space, so it's Shabbos at home, or it's workaday out in these, I should say what they are, these villages, these hamlets are derfer. It's the plural of dorf. So Lipa is what we would call a shtetl yid. He comes from the shtetl, from the small market town that has definitely not usually a majority of Jews, but a plurality of Jews, a really significant Jewish population. That's a shtetl, and he goes out to the dorf. Derfer were majority Christian. So that's all very clearly demarcated. And then the story takes place in this liminal zone in the forest. All right, presentation of non-Jews in the story. How are they depicted? What is the relationship assumed to be like between a Jew like Lipa, a simple workaday Jew, and his Christian neighbors in the broad sense, not neighbors in his immediate shtetl, but the people among whom he works and spends the week?
I thought a very interesting statement was, even though he was a Gentile, he took great pity on Lisa. In other words, usually the Gentiles would not. They would
Right.
care.
The even is carrying a large burden of implication that even if he is a Jew, we don't want to see him freeze to death. Even if he was a Gentile, he had sympathy for Lipa, meaning that the presumption is that the relations are hostile, right? And that they are alien to one another. But so it's globally hostile, but it's locally friendly. For this particular Jew, we would only wish the best. And these particular Christians were very nice to Lipa, right? So that's the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. Let's talk about the language that's used in relation to Shabbos. Did you notice anything peculiar or arresting about the way that Shabbos itself was described? I just want to go back to the end of that very first section on page 2 of your packet. That's how Lipa did things year after year, and God's blessing rested on his humble home. He lived through the entire week, whatever it brought, just so that on Shabbos the good angel would look on him and well up with joy. Nothing disturbed the holiness of the Sabbath day in the home of Lipa the tailor. So, is Shabbos an essentially positive thing or an essentially negative thing? Not negative in the sense of a bad experience, but in the sense of a set of prohibitions or a set of positive commandments that one is enjoined to do.
I think it's presented as a very cultural, not a religious experience. Because
Okay.
they don't really talk about the prayers, they talk about the food and the songs and the
Well,
candles.
prayers are in there. He does pray with the Zakanim, but yes, your point is taken that there is this real cultural Sabbath. But this language that nothing disturbed the holiness of the Sabbath
I
day.
think he didn't mind working very hard during the week, knowing that on Shabbos, he would be home with his family and it would be totally worth the labor that he did.
Right, and that there would be this kind of recompense. I think that's true. Yeah.
The whole Shabbat is pictured here is he can't wait from Sunday for Friday to come.
Mm-hmm.
Because Friday seems like a paradise. It's food, it's family,
Right.
rest. And even in on page 2 where he says he already felt the pleasure of Shabbos and the joy of fulfilling God's commandments. So it was obviously the highest point of his week was to be home with his family. It was a complete high.
Yes. So there is a very strong pleasure principle associated with the Sabbath, but there's also this language throughout of disturbing the Sabbath, marring the Sabbath, and there are 3 instances, if I'm recalling correctly, I translated this a few years ago already, but I believe that there were 3 occurrences of the word verstört werden, to be disturbed, to be marred, to be ruined even. It's a really negatively valent word. And Lipa is very concerned lest his Shabbos verstört werden, be disturbed in this way. And at the end, when he reflects on the whole experience, he has just one regret. And do you remember, did you notice what his one regret was about the way? That it wasn't just a selfish concern that he didn't get his wife's food. He said that Nechama and the children's Shabbos is verstört geworden, that it was marred, that it was ruined, because if he didn't show up for Shabbos, he was probably lying in a ditch somewhere, right? As far as she knew, that was probably the end of her beloved Lipa. So there's a real kind of double-edged presentation of Shabbos that kind of maps onto the very traditional notion of Shabbos being commanded in the first revelation of the 10 Commandments with the language of Zachor, and in Exodus, and then the second presentation in Deuteronomy as Shamor. So you have to remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. You have to have these positive experiences of food and rest and family and pleasure, but you also have to guard it from being disturbed in some way. So, okay, there's one other thing that I want to talk about that I didn't give you a reflection question about, but we'll raise it now. How is the natural world? I sort of tipped you off to this because I talked about the Bessaraber Yidden, those Bessarabian Jews and their love of nature. How is the natural world being depicted in the story? So there's the fear of being stuck in this blizzard, and it's really, it's really terrifying. It's really all-encompassing. But then there's also some very positive language about when the weather's good, right? And I'm sure you can all relate to that, right? So on page 5, at the beginning of the 5th section, says, "Suddenly he could hear a soft song arising from somewhere, floating from afar and coming closer. And what a song! A tenor so pure it would break your heart. Then a moment of silence, falling like soft dewdrops and pouring out like a lively stream amid the grassy steppe." So that's some real good Bessarabian imagery for you. "The song arose from the depths and spread itself like the wings of a mighty bird over all the chambers of the palace, reaching higher and higher. Lipa didn't move a muscle, but let the sweet song pour into every part of him. It lifted him up and carried him around like a light feather. He was amazed that the melody seemed so familiar. Couldn't he have sworn he'd heard it once in his own little synagogue? But never had he sensed its sweetness as he did now. He listened intently, and it flowed like a pure golden sound, flooded with divine joy. The words were the first phrases of the Friday night Psalms. Come, let us sing to God. L'chu niranan al Hashem. So this is all a very lyrical description of prayer that's being harnessed to a description of the grassy steppe, of a stream running over that steppe. So it's water, but it's good water. It's not too much water. It's, water is a blessing. A great bird that's bearing him up on its wings. Now, this is a really extraordinary passage because as recently as 50 years earlier, in the 1870s, we had the founder of the modern Yiddish novel, Mendele Moicher Sfarim, Mendele the book peddler, trying to goad his readers into an awareness of how very alienated they were from the natural world. He prefaces his collected works with this beautiful lyrical little passage about being out in nature, and every time he's supposed to do a mitzvah, every time he's supposed to engage in some Jewish ritual act in the natural world, he gets carried away with his love of nature. So he goes to shake the lulav, and before he knows it, he finds himself smelling the myrtle branch and the citron, the etrog that are bundled together, and he gets distracted. Or he goes to make the blessing over the new moon, and he looks up at the new moon, and she's so beautiful and she's so unattainable, and he's lovesick and forlorn over the moon, and he's distracted from the ritual. And it's an illness, and it's a pathology, and none of you should be so cursed as I, Mendele the book peddler, am because of this Liebschaft zu der Natur, this love that I have for nature. And so it's actually a really harsh critique of Eastern European Jewry as being alienated and out of sync with the natural world. 50 years later, Yankov Fichman, writing for children, is able to write a passage like the one I just read, where he is seamlessly fusing nature and Jewish ritual. So that's a really extraordinary passage I wanted to point out to you. All right. So he goes through these 6 rooms, each more gloriously appointed than the last. And what's the significance of the 6 rooms? The 6 days of Lipa's week. And then he meets the Zakenim, the elders who welcome him into the final room, who pray with him, who spend Shabbos with him, who feed him paradisal food like the fish that Nechama serves him, right? And he has this wonderful Shabbos. And at the end, they make Havdalah, they conclude the Sabbath with the ritual ceremony. The palace disappears. Lipa is standing right where he was, and nobody's any the wiser. Nobody else in their household knew quite what he meant by saying that Nechama, I've known for a long time that your Shabbos cooking has the true taste of paradise. Happy ending? Not happy ending? Did anyone discern anything other than a happy ending? Your husband thought he died. So the best children's culture that we have, and I think this is probably universally true, the best children's culture that we have is what fancy pants literary scholars like to call bisemic. Bi, two, semiotics, meaning on 2 levels. It has a meaning for its juvenile addressee, and it often has a somewhat different, more sophisticated meaning or way of being read for its adult addressee. Because remember that adults are really facilitating children's contact with cultural materials. We're buying the books, we're schlepping the kids to the library. However they're getting the books, we're helping them get the books, right? So what would the Little Match Girl reading of Lipa be?
The what?
The reading of this as a sort of Little Match Girl story.
It's all fantasy. The whole business with Shabbat and his deal with God, it's all a fantasy. He could do this without it. He could live his life without the fantasy.
Or he might have even died in the blizzard, right? That's possible. We bring him back at the end, and we don't allow that to be the predominant plot, right?
Or maybe he died and his thought about Noam and that they were so grief-stricken that they died, and the final scene here is Shemayim.
I mean, I can't support that as a plain sense reading, but that could be the fanfic, right? I saw another hand. Yeah.
Well, Shabbat was so special to him, and he thought he had such wonderful Shabbatot, but now he realizes how pathetic his normal Shabbos are compared to this glorious Shabbat.
Punkt verkehrt, just the opposite. He realizes through this glorious supernatural Shabbos how elevated his typical Shabbos is, because it's the same food that Nechama serves, and it's the same songs that they sing in his shul. He's actually being zoiche, he's actually having the merit of going to paradise for 25 hours every week, I think is the reading that we're supposed to take. Yeah, let me take quick comments, because I want to finish up and then leave time for some questions.
Just real quick on what I had said to my wife.
Yeah.
150 years ago, I read a story, I believe it was by Jack London, and it was written about in Alaska of a trapper who was on his way home.
Yes.
Ends up underneath a bush and starts a fire.
To start a fire.
Take the snow off the bush.
Yeah.
The snow comes down, kills the fire, and as he goes struggling to get back to his cabin, he ends up freezing to death.
Yeah.
They find the body 50 yards from his cabin.
Yeah.
So when you're reading this, it's the same type of feel. He's in the forest, and he's elevated, this guy's thrilled that his fire has started.
Yeah.
And it was the same type of thing, so that's why.
Dying on an elevated note, with an elevated consciousness. Yeah, I see that. Okay, quick comment, and then...
Yeah, I mean, on the bottom of page 2, it starts out, once upon a time in Beacon's Women.
Yeah.
I think there's a message there that this isn't to be, this is a fairy tale and not
Right.
to be taken too literally. But then it goes into this whole beautiful thing where this uneducated person who's not presumably studied deeply into the Kabbalah is able to reach the highest levels of spirituality.
That's right. That's right. So now I do want to just turn, and we'll get to more of these comments during the Q&A. I want to turn to the question of what makes this a socialist story. Why does a socialist labor Zionist want to write this story? Yeah.
Even in the most simple of circumstances, a family that works together, lives together, prays together, has everything.
Okay. So the simplest family, especially if they control the means of production, right, has everything that they need. And it's a point of pride that he doesn't have to go begging to lighten Chalila, to other people, God forbid.
If you
What
work
about-
hard, you won't be killed in a storm.
Okay. What about the idea that this is, to use Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's very resonant, beautiful phrase, a literal palace in time? What about what's the message about time that's being sent here? Why would this be a very socialist-friendly message about
You need time off.
the work week, time off, right? If you say that God owns 1/7 of your time, or if you say that you yourself as the worker own 1/7 of your time, either way, you're saying that the boss doesn't own 1/7 of your time. And so it's holding something in reserve for the worker. So you can see where a leftist could actually find something congenial in this sort of a story.
Wasn't it a Bund also that created in the Western world the weekend or the one day off in the week?
So
Wasn't it
the
created
Jewish,
by-
so the labor movement more broadly, which had a disproportionate level of Jewish participation. So yes, Jews were absolutely involved in the push for
Creation of a free day.
a weekend, right. So one other thing I want to say, though, about the idea of a palace in time. People can kick you out of space, any kind of space, but nobody can kick you out of time. Everybody gets the same 7 days a week, the same 24 hours a day. And so for a Jewish community that was deeply deterritorialized, and what I mean by that is that the Jews in Eastern Europe had a sense of nationhood that was not dependent upon a territorial homeland. It was a deterritorialized nation. So for a nation like that, being able to create even a symbolic edifice in time as opposed to space was a really deeply resonant, deeply appealing idea.